ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along this evening. I'm informed that the queues at Cromwell Green are incredibly long, and it's taking a very long time for anybody to get through security and into the building tonight, so we're going to crack on, because I know that some of our guests have got to be away sharpish, and people could just drift in and drift out if they so choose over the next hour or so. I'm delighted to be here this evening to host what is an incredibly important discussion about an incredibly important part of the world at an incredibly important time. And we have with us to discuss the UK and the Gulf security priorities for 2020 three very, very interesting and speakers who are very much schooled and learned in the discussion that we're going and the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. I'll start on my right. Ellie. Ellie is a Senior Policy Fellow and Deputy Head of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. To my left, General Sir Simon Mayall has a distinguished 40-year career. I know he's known to some people in the room already in the British Army, during which he served in Germany, Northern Ireland, the Balkans, the Middle East and Central Asia, and he has also held several high-level appointments in the policy world of the Ministry of Defence. And to my far right, a gentleman who needs no introduction to this building, Sir Michael Fallon, former Member of Parliament for Sevenoaks and Darlington, and from 2014 to 2017 was the Secretary of State for Defence and a member of the National Security Council. So on that, I'm going to hand over to General Sir Simon to start us off this evening.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. Really nice to be back in the House of Commons. I notice it's already been packed up to move somewhere. Yet to be decided, I suppose. I think it's very important time to be discussing the Gulf. We're headed towards the SDSR. I hope that the context is going to be heavily set by the Prime Minister's enthusiasm both for the Brexit process and for the reality that we need to get out and about in a part of the world. And it's very easy, I think, when people talk about the Middle East to slightly horrifically continue to define it by problems in Iraq and problems in Syria and the horrors on the borders with the Kurds and riots in Lebanon and riots in population growth in Egypt, etc. That the Middle East is extremely diverse, and for those of you who know the Gulf, and those of you who've been there recently, you'll know that the Gulf represents an extraordinary, hardly an oasis given that it's in the middle of the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, of stability in many ways, and huge opportunity, and huge change is taking place there. And the Gulf has been remarkable in terms of taking the wealth it inherited through oil and gas in the ground, and through, I think, extraordinary stewardship, given the journey they went on from very, very conservative, patriarchal, old-fashioned states with very little other than, honestly, herding, pearl fishing, a bit of piracy in the 19th century. The stewardship of the great city-states of the Gulf, I think, are quite extraordinary tribute to the way they have managed that wealth. And again, those of you who know the Gulf know that they are very conscious of the requirement for diversification, for building human capital, for imagining a world without oil as such. Although it is worth remembering that there is no scenario whatsoever that rules oil and fossil fuels out of the energy equation of the world 2040, 2050. So at the moment, although 80% of the oil turns east as it comes out of the Straits of Hormuz going to China, even though the Americans are independent of energy, etc., somebody needs those supplies, and somebody needs a stable foundation from which to get those supplies at a reasonable rate. And the Gulf states have survived the Iran-Iraq war, they've survived the Gulf War, they've survived AQ, they've survived 9/11, they've survived the botched occupation invasion of Iraq, they've survived the Arab Spring. I could say survived, a sad ending to the great hopes that perhaps we had. And yes, they've got money. Yes, that money buys them time. They have far more legitimacy than many critics of the Gulf states give them, because there's a certain aversion to royalty. They have a larger degree of homogeneity than perhaps the republics certainly have. Yes, there is a Sunni Shia split. They have demonstrate a huge amount of flexibility. Some of the leadership, I think, is absolutely outstanding. There is a lot of participatory politics, and there's an alignment to the mainstream of the cultural thing. And they have had good friends. the UK very firmly among them. I was in Saudi Arabia last week, and again, for those of you who have an image of Saudi Arabia or know it well and have gone back, you'll know how dramatically it's changing. It sounds like obvious stuff to us that people should mix in restaurants and women should drive cars. But again, I don't need to tell you, any watchers of Saudi Arabia, this is seriously challenging stuff. The reality is that 50% of Saudi Arabians are under the age of 20. 50% of Saudi Arabia was not alive at the time of 9/11. It defined my life, it defined most of a certain age. That means 25% of Saudi Arabian people are women under 20. That genie is out of the bottle. You can put it back, and people like the Iranian Ayatollahs will try to, and nations of Hezbollah, but that is going to be very, very difficult to do so. I was in Qatar. The joint UK-Qatar Typhoon Squadron has just completed its conversion course. I was in Bahrain visiting the new naval base the other day, the new Mayall Square, he said with some pride, has just been opened, which is a mark of our commitment back then. And I'm going to Oman next week, where a bunch of us who served the Sultan of Oman in the 1980s are going back on a trip down memory lane. So those links between Britain and the Gulf are really strong. We have a new UK government. We are going to be out of Europe. People call it a crisis, but as we know, a crisis in Chinese biogram is both danger and opportunity. To my mind, this is all about opportunity. And we have an SDSR that absolutely needs to grasp the fact that our security and defence depend on our prosperity. We only pay for the armed forces we have with a healthy economy without diverting my way. So where is growth, where is money, where is prosperity? It still remains in the Gulf that continues to look for stability. And we need to recalibrate that relationship. It has been very on-off, really, since we chose to withdraw from the Gulf in 1971. And it's always been important to us. The East India Company had to protect its routes both round the Cape and up from Bombay to Basra, across to Aleppo and into the Mediterranean. And we, the British, were seen off other imperial predators. We were certainly seen off the Iranians, the Persians, and Gulf pirates. And we have policed the Gulf, or we did police the Gulf really from the early 19th century. And the great truce that we all talk about, sometimes the trucial states, etc., were about the Gulf states or the Gulf tribes at that stage asking the British to police a truce between themselves. And lo and behold, after all that, and the loyalty we were shown, or the affection we were shown even up to the Second World War, where Bahrain, as I keep reminding people, with no army, declared on behalf of the British and gave a cheque to the British agent there for £30,000 to go towards 10 Spitfire fighters, and were bombed for their trouble by the Italians. And amazingly, as the King of Bahrain said to me, you protected us for nearly 150 years when we had absolutely nothing. And then in 1968, just as we had discovered oil and we were on our way to huge wealth, the largest transfer of wealth in history, you buggered off. And he's right. And one of the most disastrous foreign policy decisions we ever made, to my mind, was the 68 decision to withdraw from Eastern Suez. And by the time Ted Heath got in 70, it was actually getting a bit too late to go back. Although we did stay in Oman to fight the war there against in the Dhofar. And so our track record there is good, but it's patchy. We thought we would go back into the Gulf in 1991. Everybody expected Margaret Thatcher would have recommitted to a British presence in the Gulf, a permanent British presence. And sadly, at that stage, she had been defenestrated by her own party. And in 1995, the American came in with the Fifth Fleet. I remember in 2001, again, we tried to pull out of a big exercise we were going to do with the Omanis. And lo and behold, a number of us went round, rallied round, and said, no, you can't do this. Oman's been one of our greatest supporters in the Gulf. We went back on exercise, and while we were deploying onto that exercise, 9/11 happened. And lo and behold, thank God it did, because what would we have done if we had deserted the Sultan, who had been so generous and loyal to us over so many years? Cameron, when he came in 2010, started a thing called the Gulf Initiative. We then set up a post called Defence Senior Advisor Middle East. It's great to see John Lorimer here, who's now my successor and successor's successor. And for anybody in Parliament here, please do not let that role wither on the vine. There's always a temptation to cherry pick. And I remember saying we must have a Gulf strategy. We still don't really have a Gulf strategy. We must commit properly. And we said, when are we not going to be involved in the Gulf? We have 200,000 expatriates spread across the Gulf, 80,000 in the Emirates alone. And we need to reverse the Eastern Suez decision. And I said to Philip Hammond, I remember saying, we have not had a policy for the Gulf, we the British, since the policy was to get out of the Gulf. And Philip Hammond said to me, yes, I hear you, Simon, but we have in fact been in the Gulf for the intervening 40 years. I said, no, we haven't, with respect, Secretary of State. We've been there 1 year, 40 times. And for people with the longevity of the Gulf monarchies and the Gulf families, that looks inconsistent. And it looks ludicrous given the scale of our investment out there, the interest we have, defence, security, prosperity. And I wrote that we looked mean-spirited, petty, tight-fisted, and ungracious. And in Arab culture, none of those are particularly attractive qualities. After the setbacks in Iraq and Afghanistan, we did go back to establish the first permanent military British base east of Suez in Bahrain, which is where, as I say, the great Mayall Square is. And even that, paid for the generosity of the Bahrainis, was rejected or pushed back from the Foreign Office, from the Ministry of Defence, the Royal Navy. And luckily, I said, you build it, we will come, we will shame them. And now we talk quite legitimately and policy terms of the UK's back east of Suez. And so, since the election, everywhere I go in the Middle East, the great cry is, we're hoping we've got our old Britain back. The Britain that didn't hide behind the skirts of the European Union to say it's all a bit difficult, this, that, the other. We have government direction that we're going for global Britain. We need to get all elements of the United Kingdom behind that. We've got to get over an institutional aversion, a consent and evade to a thing. We've got to get our message. I would say the Gulf security remains as vital as it always has. Energy security, see, I've mentioned the scenarios on energy supplies, and that China continues to make inroads there, and the US is retrenching. It is the only stable area of the Middle East to an extent. Nothing is better. If we encourage instability in the Gulf, there is nothing better. We haven't learned from our experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, etc., that we think there is some liberal Democrat party waiting to come out of the pigeonholes to take over from the House of Saud or the other monarchies. Let us be absolutely clear how legitimate these people feel with the people they have. And so we need a range of requirements: economic, education, health, and defence and security. There's a raft of areas where these societies are feeling very beleaguered and looking, frankly, to their first natural port of call remains the United Kingdom. And to my mind, in helping our own prosperity agenda, we should be helping feed the security and defence agenda of our long-standing friends. So I'm hoping to goodness under the SDSR that we have a clear-sighted assessment of UK's national interest, not some of the dreadful posturing and patronising approaches of the last years. And the United Kingdom commits very firmly to building on the huge amount of well of affection and self-interest we have across the Gulf states. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Leave it at that.
So Simon, that was absolutely fascinating. And we'll come to questions slightly later on in proceedings. But now I'd like to ask Ellie Geranmayeh to say a few words from your perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you to CMEC for hosting us. I wanted to I think Sir Simon set out the backdrop very well. I'm going to take a more expansive view of the Gulf region to include both Iran and Iraq as well, in terms of where I think the priorities for the UK should be focused on coming year. Just to give you a little bit of background, I've been working with the European Council on Foreign Relations for almost 7 years, primarily focused on relations with Iran. But of course that takes us everywhere from the US to Iraq to the GCC states. I've been traveling extensively to Iraq. I just returned over the weekend from the UAE and Oman, where we're really considering pathways for regional de-escalation at a very tense time. So I'm afraid what I'm about to say is slightly more gloomy and has a lot of flashpoints ahead for where UK priorities should be. I just caveat most of what I'm saying with I think, understanding that the bandwidth in the UK will be impacted, I think, both by the transatlantic relations and how they influence ties to the Gulf region, but also relations with Europe, which we've seen remain united, at least till now, on issues like the nuclear deal with Iran, but those things may get pushed in different directions the closer we get to the end of this year. And so I think looking ahead, the UK really has to look at what its core priorities are in terms of its key interests and also where it can have most influence, because there are a number of conflicts in the region at the moment that impact directly or indirectly the UK, but there is only so much that can be had in terms of influence and impact. So I'll limit my points to three main areas where I think there should be strategic priority. First, Iraq. The first heading there, I would say the UK really needs to look at its involvement in the counter-ISIS coalition going forward. This is an area of priority for both the US, the UK, and European allies, particularly as the relationship with Baghdad becomes more and more strained given recent events. And so how the UK operates with its troops on the ground as part of the coalition or not, I think will be important, particularly in terms of ensuring the stability of Iraq, preventing a wave of counterinsurgency, which many experts are predicting in the coming years ahead, and also securing, frankly, UK's assets on the ground, whether that's military or economic. Another area I think where there should be real focus for the UK on Iraq is ring-fencing Iraq from the growing US-Iran tensions that we've seen really play out most visibly in Iraq. It's very clear that none of the relevant factions in Iraq are interested in being caught in the mix of this escalation. And I think, frankly, most of the political centers of power in Iraq are looking for partners, including the UK and other European governments, to help ring-fence against Iraq being caught in the middle. And one area where I think the UK can have concrete impact is using its relations with the United States, particularly in Congress, the US Treasury, and the US administration, to prevent an extension of the maximum pressure campaign against Iran from rippling into Iraq, particularly when it comes to economic pressure, potential sanctions that may impact Iraq's energy sector, and access to revenues. The second area, which kind of pairs with the Iraq question, is really preventing military escalation in the Gulf region. And here the center focal point is the knock-on impact of the US-Iran tensions that have been growing. And we've seen that playing out, I think, at a peak in terms of military escalations in January with the killing of Qasem Soleimani and Iran's response of attacking bases hosting the US inside Iraq. And I think that has really shown that there can be real inadvertent consequences, despite the fact that both sides clearly want to avoid a direct military conflict. Sometimes events pull them in a direction that perhaps neither Washington or Tehran wants. And clearly there is a lot of room in the region for black swan events that none of us can predict in this room, including, for example, the tragic shooting down of the Ukraine airliner by Iran in the aftermath of the tensions with the US. And so what the UK, I think, can do on this front is twofold mainly. I think that particularly the UK Prime Minister has a distinctive role in terms of relations with both Washington, President Trump directly, but also, interestingly, Iran. I don't think Prime Minister Johnson has a soured relationship with Tehran, and I think here he can actually play a useful role in pushing both sides towards a political track. We've seen the French President Emmanuel Macron try and push for this. I do think we're at a point where perhaps the baton may be passed from the French side to the UK side, particularly, for example, in places like the G7 summit coming up in the summer, where the UK Prime Minister now, with a much more strong domestic positioning, can have a more extended role on foreign policy issues, including the US and Iran. A second area here, which I think will be a key issue for the UK going forward, is its role as a stakeholder to the nuclear deal. So far, we've seen the UK remain in a unified position with other countries in Europe, France and Germany. And I do think it will be very important for the UK to maintain that role if it is to have any influence to try and prevent further expansion of Iran's nuclear program by maintaining this channel of dialogue with Iran for a process of negotiation, which is, I think, what is happening right now between the Europeans and Iran. A third area where I think we should flag on the priorities, and it marries with the point that Sir Simon made, is working with traditional partners in the Gulf. As I mentioned, I've just been to Oman and the UAE, and I feel a huge opening at the moment for allies in Europe, including the United Kingdom, I say particularly the United Kingdom, to have a more expanded engagement when it comes to this issue of regional de-escalation, but also in terms of economic cooperation to stabilize the countries in the region. Here I would say Oman is coming out of a transition phase. It's clear to me that the economic issue is of priority, and they see the UK as one of the biggest economic partners for that. And one of the things that came out from my trip is if we want countries like Oman to continue playing the role of facilitating regional dialogue between the GCC and Iran, they need to have a strong, stable economy to do that. And countries like the UK can play a role in bolstering that position. Also, the United Arab Emirates, I think, is now in a very interesting position when it comes to calibrating what the US maximum pressure campaign means for regional players, including the UAE. We've seen, I think, one of the main costs from the US-Iran tensions being borne out by regional players like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And I sense an opening from the UAE in particular to pursue off-ramps, political off-ramps. And they see European countries like the UK, but others as well, including France, as being able to facilitate that regional de-escalation process. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the exchange ahead.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Quite a lot to get our teeth into there as well. And last but certainly not least, Sir Michael.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much and good evening. And thank you for inviting me back. I thought I'd got away from this place. I'm not sure that I still have to declare an interest, but I am Deputy Chairman of Ganal Energy, which has oil and gas interests in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And I'm an advisor to Investcorp, which was originally Bahraini-based. I agree with both the two panelists. I mean, this is a very good time to be re-examining our relationship with the Gulf. We have this promised comprehensive security defence review underway now. We have the opportunity after Brexit of a new trade deal with the GCC as a whole, which I think has been neglected as a topic. And of course we now have the Foreign Secretary back in the Gulf. So it is a good time to look and see whether we should recalibrate and how we should recalibrate. And obviously that includes, as my fellow panelists have said, the right response to continuing Iranian aggression, the continuing threat of Islamist fundamentalism, and how we protect our surviving UK interests in the region. It's worth reminding ourselves what we committed to in the last Defence and Security Review in 2015 that Simon and I and General John and others worked on. We committed first to a permanent and more substantial military presence, building on but not confined to HMS Jafar in Bahrain. We committed to developing those historic relationships across the Gulf, reflecting both the long-term nature of those relationships, the challenges and the opportunities. And thirdly, we committed to continuing to offer reassurance to our friends in the Gulf. Now, I think we've fulfilled that over the last 4 or 5 years. We saw extensive cooperation between the UK and the Gulf countries in the coalition to deal militarily with Daesh, allowing us to use the bases there, helping with other logistics. And we've seen also significant resources contributed by this country to Safe Syria 3, a major exercise. We've seen strengthening of the bilateral relationships that we have through the work of General Simon and General John with the individual countries in the Gulf. But looking ahead, it still seems to me that the strategic imperative that General Simon outlined remains. The security of the Gulf is in the end the security of this country, and there is no getting away from that. And that is, first of all, the security of our trade and energy supply routes. Protecting transit through the Strait of Hormuz from the Gulf, through the Bab el-Mandeb from the Red Sea, is just as important for this country as the international waterways elsewhere, like Malacca, the waterway into the Pacific. Second, our homeland security depends on us dealing with the threat of terrorism. Many of the attacks we've seen in recent years have been inspired, orchestrated, or directed from outside this country. I know some have been homegrown, but others have been directed from outside, and we cannot afford, as a country, to see the embers of Daesh fanned again, either in Iraq, or to see further affiliates of AQ start out of the chaos of some of the other conflicts that we've seen. And finally, as Simon, I think, has brought out, our political and commercial interests as a country are interlocked. They do depend on the stability of the region, and they've certainly stand to be affected by any destabilization, whether it's conducted by Iran or anybody else. Now, what should we be looking to do about all that in the next defence review? In my judgment, and I want to try, Andrew, just to shatter some of the consensus around here, because otherwise you'll just have three people agreeing with each other. I think we need to do three things, and I don't agree, I'm afraid, with my colleague here. I think first we need to be much more clear-sighted and hard-headed about Iranian aggression. The JCPOA was not a comprehensive agreement, and clearly it is not a successful agreement. It is disintegrated. And of course we can play a moderating role perhaps between Europe and the United States, but equally we do need a wider and better agreement that properly constrains the ability of Iran to interfere in other countries and to use its access that it's enabled to have to the international financial system to promote instability elsewhere. Secondly, I think we need to regularize protection of these international waterways. The tankers were first attacked last May. The European force is not arriving in the Gulf, as I understand it, until next week or the week after, some 10 months later. I'm not sure what the French for brain dead is, but you do have to wonder just why it has taken Europe so long. The Australians committed immediately to that international force, and we have to be there. And of course it has to involve the United States. And I think we need to look to see how these international waterways can be more permanently and better protected without us always looking over our shoulders saying, will it upset somebody on one side of the Gulf or the other? And third, I think, and this perhaps is controversial, or more controversial, I think we ought to use the opportunity of the review to rethink the credibility of our military posture. And I say that in no disrespect to the arrangements that we had and the support we had in the Gulf for the coalition against the Daesh. And the posture we have there, the mine hunters are useful, having the typhoons there, the joint force helps, of course, having the training and the exchanges and the exercises, all of that helps. But when it came to the crunch as Secretary of State, when I was faced with the need to deal with a very direct terrorist threat, or the need to plan the potential rescue of a British hostage, then of course our posture did not suffice. Of course, we would, in that kind of planning, we had to rely on other people, notably the Americans, for the surveillance, the helicopters, the medevac and the other support that these kind of operations need. So I think perhaps we ought to use this opportunity to be a bit more serious about what we mean by permanent presence in the Gulf. I'd like to see those aircraft carriers calling in just at Duqm, but also in Bahrain as well. I'd like to see a frigate or a destroyer based more permanently in the Gulf, not just the mine hunters. I'd like to see a helicopter force available at all times in the Gulf, rather than sometimes having to be flown out with the delays involved. And I'd like to see more of our rapid reaction forces, an element of those rapid reaction forces available in the Middle East for when trouble breaks out. We've got an expanding defence budget now. It's been growing steadily over the last few years. I'm hoping it's going to grow again. And I think there's a real opportunity not just to say we should be back east of Suez, we should be in Indo-Pacific, but saying how, and actually starting to commit real forces that can help us in times of trouble. Thank you.
Well, thank you all three for three very fascinating insights into the UK's position in the Gulf and the wider region, and the situation in the Gulf region just now. I'm going to abuse my position as chair to ask the first question. I will ask quick questions, and I would very much welcome quick answers, because we only have 18 or so minutes before votes in the House of Commons. So Simon, you spoke, you briefly sort of skimmed over American energy independence. And all three speakers this evening have spoken about the need for America to be involved in whatever posture that we take or whatever coalition we form in the region. Is there a fear from somebody like yourself, who from a military perspective has been involved in the Gulf for quite a long time, that America will lose interest in the Gulf region, that their knee-jerk foreign policy right now is being driven by a White House who's very unpredictable? Do you worry that the Americans don't have a long-term interest in the Gulf, and do you think that will affect our position out there as well?
Well, I think it will. But funnily enough, I think there's an opportunity in here, and Ellie's referred to it, and it's great to hear Sir Michael again talk about, how do we leverage off this for wider British national interest? And in many ways, it feeds into Trump saying, well, our allies aren't doing enough. To an extent, we can do a bit more heavy lifting in the Gulf, to my mind. I do think a permanent frigate out there, I do think a bit more forward positioning allows the Americans to actually go where they are inclined to focus a bit more, which is the Indo-Pacific area and the sort of China, if you look at a threat or a challenge, certainly. And so we would then be able, to my mind, politically leverage off that, or Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab, to say, look, I know you keep talking about NATO, but we'll try and do NATO, but we'll actually do some bilateral stuff in an area where we sense you are doing a bit of retrenchment, because actually the energy equation allows you to, or provokes you to do it. It doesn't allow us quite the same, so let us lean into here, America, and let us also then leverage off that for political and diplomatic advantage. So I think we should be going there, and I think we should also be imaginative about what we can achieve from there on the prosperity side, and what we can achieve from it diplomatically with our allies.
Thank you very much. Ellie?
Well, look, from my discussions with regional players, what we've seen happen under the Trump administration vis-a-vis the region is really an extension of what had been seen under the Obama administration in terms of this retrenchment. I think the way that the Trump administration is doing it is far more unpredictable, perhaps in some ways undiplomatic, in the view of some in the region. And so there is this sense that that trust in the alliance was damaged under the Obama administration, according to some folks in the GCC, but it's not really back to normal now either. And there is a sense that everybody's hedging their bets against what will happen in November in the US elections, and they're trying to diversify their partners. Now, part of that diversification is including China and Russia, frankly, and part of it will include, I think, European interlocutors.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think it's always a mistake to draw these rigid lines between the Obama administration was that way and, the Trump administration is going that way, or there's a division, real distinction between what Boris Johnson is doing and what Theresa May and David Cameron were trying to do. Usually these changes take place in the middle of administrations, actually, rather than at the very beginning. I mean, there's always been this pull to the Pacific for America. It's last two big wars were in the Pacific, not in the Gulf or over here. So that's been going on anyway. And if you look at the evidence, the carrier, the American carrier is still there. American troops are there. The bases are there. America has not withdrawn. And if you look at some of the, if you look at what actually happens after Trump makes his announcements and go back a month or two afterwards, the troops haven't actually gone from either Afghanistan or even some of them from northern Syria. It's not quite as stark as that. But there is an opportunity, and clearly we are as dependent, particularly on the international waterways, as anybody else. We have the Navy. European countries have the ability to step up to this, and really it is time they did so.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, I think I'll open to the floor for questions. Anybody? How about you first? If nobody asks, I'll ask another one. Yes?
Well, it's sort of more statements may evolve into a question. I worry, and I don't disagree with Simon on what anybody's actually said. I just worry that we're not being realistic. Because I was ambassador in Iraq when we had 10,000 troops there, and we had troops in Afghanistan. Then I moved to Afghanistan and we had 10,000 troops in Afghanistan, and we still had troops in Iraq. Every session I go to now, and I was with Mark Carlton Smith, suggested to me 85,000 troops. We couldn't do that now. We could not have a presence in Afghanistan. We couldn't deliver a division to Iraq as part of an American invasion. So we're very limited capability. And I wonder if, even in an expanding budget, that's going to change much. So we're probably, and what we're trying to do is more with less. Because I don't disagree, we need to commit to the Gulf. But in an area where the US is both hesitant and inconsistent, and I agree with Michael, it started under Obama a little bit under, but the attack on Abqaiq by the Iranians, the Americans basically told the Saudis, you're on your own if you want to take this further. So it'll be building up a serious relationship with the UAE and Saudi Arabia at a time when that is politically becoming much more difficult. I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and I never envisaged we'd be in a position where we couldn't sell arms to Saudi Arabia, which is where we are at the moment. We're in a position where we can't sell arms to Saudi Arabia because of Yemen. So the environment is much more complex, much more difficult. Our capacity is less. I'm not saying we should try the things that you're talking about, but we have to be realistic in how much we can achieve.
Yeah. Can I make two very quick points? One, a rather trite expression, but at the Myanmar dialogue, when I heard the Americans, two people up there, and I take Michael's point entirely, what the Americans say, what they do. But the rhetoric and the actions break trust. And my slightly cliche was, the one thing you can't surge in the region is trust. You can surge troops in, you can surge aircraft, you can't surge trust. When people begin to get nervous, and particularly when power is very personal and it's family, I'm worried actually about my grandson being one. I think that is what has been really damaging about America. The other one I would say is we're not trying to put 10,000 troops in. I think I'd rather have a bigger army, because I think if you use it imaginatively, you can cover an awful lot of bases. But I wish to goodness we'd put a battalion on a rotational basis into UAE when we thought about it. The French have gone in, ahead of us, they put a naval base in there, they put a French Foreign Legion battalion in there, they put a squadron of Rafale because the Middle East counts them, and then they turn to the likes of Mohammed bin Zayed and say, oh, that big metro deal over there, what about these nuclear reactors? And we have this mindset in the United Kingdom that military presence means defence sales. Military presence means we feed your sense of insecurity, and we'd like you to feel our sense of economic insecurity. And the French are much better at making that connection. You're right, we couldn't do the big heavy lifting, but to my mind, leaning in with some troops on the ground whether Oman or UAE, I think, to my mind, it's a good use of the sunk costs of our military. A frigate, a squadron of aircraft somewhere in the Gulf, constantly seen, used by ambassadors like yourself or ministers like Michael going out there as it was, to demonstrate we're serious. We're not going to disappear around the horizon again. That's the sort of mood music I would be arguing strongly for.
Michael, to my mind, this is exactly what global Britain should mean. Now, global Britain's been a phrase that's been on the go since, before I got elected in 2017. But nobody's been ever able to explain to, MPs, let alone the wider public or the wider world, what it actually means. So, as a former Secretary of State for Defence, might you sort of give your
Well, I think, there is no hiding place now. We've got to work out what it means.
Yeah.
Given we've now legally left Europe and we're completing, we hope, the trade agreement with Europe this year, we've now got to get on. with the trade agreements elsewhere and actually decide how global we're going to be and what commitments that is going to involve. And that isn't just talking, about, using these words like posture and, and a more occasional presence and sending an aircraft carrier through the South China Sea. We've got to think out exactly where we need to be on a more permanent basis. And I'm sure you would accept so. Well, no, I don't think putting a division, is feasible anymore. But I'm absolutely with Simon, to have some elements of a rapid reaction force, to have more enablers there, and to have more bigger ships, coming through and basing themselves there, I think would go a long way.
Can I just add to that? From my recent discussions with regional players, I wouldn't say everybody is in agreement about whether the solution to the region's instability is going to come from the military side. And so actually, I do think a stepped up political engagement right now is where the value can be added much more extensively.
Thank you. Yes, I'll take yourself and then...
I'm the head of the Arab League mission in London. I will follow up on what Sir William said about the complexity of the situation in the Middle East. It's quite complex. And Ellie, you mentioned now something related to having a dialogue between ourselves. Is it not time for us to think about regional security versus just, getting help from the UK or any other power? Of course, this might not be the perfect time to do that, with all the differences in the region, and the rifts, and all that. It's a combustible region, of course, right now with all the problems taking place. But should we look far ahead? And the UK can play a role in that, helping us to eventually take care of our own business.
Ellie, I'll ask you to come back on that in a second. Yes.
To touch upon perhaps what I feel is a subject that's not directly discussed this evening, but cannot be decoupled from the discussion we're having, is the idea that defence policy abroad, especially in the Gulf, is intrinsically linked to our foreign policy. And I think without having seriously thought through, and this goes back to Michael's point, to William's point, without having seriously thought through where Britain lies in the world, especially relationships in what's take forward in the Middle East, I do not think it can be effective in putting forward a defence policy or even a defence review. And to what extent do the panel think that there's been some serious consideration going on how far are we down the road of really considering not only our security partnerships in the Gulf, but actually a much bigger question, our foreign policy priorities for the next 5, 10, 15 years? To what extent have we thought about that?
It's a very interesting question. It's one that's coming up time and time again. Should this review be foreign policy led, or should it be treasury led? And I think that's one that's going to run and run. And there was one last question I'll take in this round. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Ali, this was former Bahrain MP. My question to Mr. Simon here about Simon.
About?
Simon.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. About the strategy of British and Bahrain, British troops or British, I don't know, UK naval that was established back in 2013. And I've heard here from one of the ministers say, like, we went back to Bahrain, or we are back to Bahrain, to please Bahrain and to confer the Bahrain government or rulers there. Like Iranian, they are not going to come to Bahrain here in order to implement whatever Bahrain demands. And so we're looking from perspective of Bahraini governments only. What about the Bahraini people? I still remember, and I read about this in 1968 when the state minister from UK went to Bahrain. He met with the rulers there, Mr. Robert, I think his name. And there was a question from Bahrain Prime Minister 50 years before, like, is British government sure about leaving Bahrain to big three players? Persia, he mentioned, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And I think this fears, there is nothing from Saudi Arabia, the strategic allies to Bahrain, and Kuwait, Iran, which is just before Islamic Republic. That was my question.
Thank you. So we've got UK involvement in regional security, defence policy, foreign policy, in terms of the defence review, foreign policy red, and British and Bahraini relations. So
I'll take the first question.
Yes.
There are multiple, as I'm sure you're aware, multiple roadmaps flying around at the moment for regional security in the region. I think as external players, particularly sitting in Europe, we have to be very humble about what we can put into this process. I do think that there is a role for facilitating dialogue and supporting the regional actors once the key players are all ready for that discussion to take place. From my understanding, some of the key players are not yet ready for that discussion. And I don't see that happening until the outcome of November is much more clear. I would say where I do think there is a UK role, as I alluded in my opening statements, is in trying to find a political off-ramp for US-Iran relations, because I think so long as that tension is at a peak, and so long as Iran is in an economic war deadlock with the US, it's going to be very hard to come to a regional security roadmap with US partners on the ground. So the UK, I think, can help, particularly using its relations with Washington and Tehran, to dial down the temperature on that front, to enable an environment where that regional dialogue can take place.
Michael, if you don't mind, I'll come to you on the SDSR and what should we be thinking behind it.
Sure, I was just going to have one
Sorry,
sentence
yes, please,
on the first question, which I just to repeat again what I said. I think we should use the opportunity of the opening up of a trade agreement with the GCC as a whole to start encouraging where we can. I keep being reassured that it's not the aim of anybody to try and collapse the GCC. And I think there really is an opportunity as a major trading partner in the Gulf for Britain to play that and shore it up on the commercial side with that new trade agreement that may then lead on to how we foster cooperation on security. On the defence review, yes, I think, be careful how I say this, but I think the whole Brexit thing has kind of suffocated the natural emergence of a refreshed foreign policy over the last few years. Because we've just said, well, it'll be global Britain, and we haven't been able to say what it is. And you've had successive foreign secretaries, advocating very worthy causes, girls' education or stopping the persecution of Christians or journalists around the world. But they're not foreign policies. And, we do need to get the foreign policy right, which is why I was actually quite pleased by the terms of reference for this defence review. It is aimed, I think the word comprehensive is in there, it is aimed at bringing foreign and defence policy together in a way perhaps we didn't in 2015 even. We brought all the different security aspects together, but we didn't perhaps bring foreign and DFID into it. And we need to do it right across the piece. And as I understand the terms of reference, that is what the government is now committing to do.
Simon, I'll come to you to talk about Britain and Bahrain, conscious that in 2 minutes' time bells are about to ring.
Well, one very quick one. From the Middle East usual quiet, you can't, it's very difficult to solve one thing without solving all of them. The real danger from Iran, because Iran has a parasitic nature, to my mind. It can live off a host and stop it ever being healthy. And the problem with Iran, when it acts as a regional player, champion of Islamic Republic, and a champion of Shias, it means in Baghdad, in Damascus, and Beirut, and Sana'a, it absolutely stops solving any of these. And it's not in Iran's interest to solve them. It weakens the Arab world horribly. But I do think Britain still has a convening power, and we can do what we can in areas where I genuinely think we have a influence, which is the Gulf. I really hope we're going to lead with the foreign policy. The key there with the foreign policy is then you can give some military strategy that says your policy implies to me that this is what we should be using the military for. So what are your high-level assumptions? And the one about Bahrain, the King of Bahrain, or the Emir of Bahrain, and Sheikh Zayed, said, we will pay for the British to stay in the Gulf. Why are you going? But unfortunately, and this is what happens in politics, the hue of the government at the time was very anti-colonial, not, as we all know, that the Gulf states were ever colonies. They were dependent states. And there was a feeling that if we had a nuclear policy, a nuclear deterrent, and we wanted to commit to the central region with NATO, we'd take the hit. We'd take the hit east of Suez. It was a stupid decision to my mind. And it's very interesting that when you go back, of course the Khalifas still remember that offer. Of course the Nayanis remember that offer. And hence, to them, it's business excellent. Britain's back where it should be. And it doesn't necessarily needed to be Bahrain, but that makes eminent sense because we're alongside the coalition headquarters and the American Fifth Fleet there. So I think it was very well supported by the Saudi Arabians and the UAE when the King of Bahrain generously said, you know, if I build it, I hope you will come. And we have.
So Simon, thank you very, very much. On that note, I'm going to wrap up formal proceedings. I've got to go and vote against Labour's motion saying that we don't care about the health service. I would like to thank everybody for taking part this evening. Ellie, Sir Simon and Sir Michael for giving up their very valuable time to come in here this evening. I would thank everybody for coming in and asking your questions. I'm sure that the panellists would be happy to hang around, although some I know I've got to leave, to take any other questions that you have. I'd especially like to thank CMEC for laying on this evening. Sir Simon, General Sir Simon is pointing out the fact that he has a book coming out. And he wouldn't have let me go downstairs without pointing at it. Soldier in the Sand. And you, on the very handily, you can even order it on the back of this flyer, pre-order, which is on the back.
25% if you get in on that one.
And I'm sure CMEC would be rather put out if I didn't mention their upcoming event, which is on the 18th of March, Women in the Arab World, which will be fascinating, shaping the future and challenging stereotypes. And on that note, thank you very, very much for coming on. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Cheers, thanks.
I'll ask you again.